Hi, I'm Richard Bailey. I'm a former stock assessment biologist with DFO, and I'm going to be presenting on the Chinook stocks and life history variations within the Nicola drainage. So within the Nicola itself, we have 4 Chinook stocks, possibly 4, certainly 3. We have the Nicola stock, stock in Spies Creek, stock in Coldwater River, and then possibly a 4th remnant in the upper Nicola and Spokane Creek. Those 4 stocks are all part of the Lower Thompson Spring 1.2 Conservation Unit and Designatable Unit. They're typically maturing at 4 years old and are springtime Chinook stocks. So providing a map here that one of my former techs put together, and this map highlights the distribution of the stocks within the watershed. You can see the Coldwater stock in green, the Spies stock in orange, and then in mauve the Nicola mainstem stock, and blue above Nicola Lake the Spokane and upper Nicola stock. And you can see also that there are overlap areas on Spies between Big Box and Little Box Canyon, and on the Coldwater sort of between Kingsvale down through IR1. And those are overlaps between the early run stocks in the upper watershed and the distribution of the spawning of the later run Nicola stock. As I've mentioned, those are the spatial overlaps. Those overlaps are spatial, but not so much in timing. There's a considerable timing separation between the populations such that the early run Coldwater fish and early run Spies fish have typically finished spawning right around the onset of spawning for the later Nicola run population. So the timing of the stocks themselves, the Spies Creek stock and the Coldwater stock, the arrival typically happens starting in mid to late April, and the last of the stragglers coming in will be in August, but the vast majority of those fish are in May and June into the system, and they have to make it by the thermal barrier that sets up in lower Spies and lower Coldwater, where the water becomes really too warm for them to migrate through there in July. The Nicola stock itself, the sort of larger population, it typically shows up starting in June, but the vast majority of the in-migration is in late July. And then those fish, they spawn in those lower sections and in the Nicola mainstem in September. The timing of arrival in the terminal area and the onset of spawning itself is definitely regulated by the access to the spawning grounds and those extreme terminal areas, and that's that thermal barrier that I was talking about in lower Coldwater and lower Spies. And then also the temperatures of the intra-gravel environment. Obviously the spawn timing, the fish need to put the eggs in the gravel such that they accumulate the right number of accumulated thermal units such that emergence is at the right period of time. Within those stocks, all are typically yearling smolts, so they spend a year in fresh water before going to sea. In previous times, 1998, we had a pretty poor escapement, the poorest that we'd seen during the assessment program to date. There was some attempt made by Spies Creek Hatchery to accelerate some smolts and release them as 0 pluses to compensate for that poor escapement, and there was some success of return with those 0 pluses, but it's really the only 0 pluses that I've seen in the system. And again, the maturation typically for the yearling smolts happens at ages 3, 4, and 5, 3s being jacks and 5s being fairly large adults, but the vast majority occurs as 4-year-olds. We have on occasion observed precocious yearlings. So these are fish that didn't smolt, remained in the system, and matured. They're males. We refer to them as jimmies. They're about 5 or 6 inches long, and they are fully mature and will sneak spawn. Now, precocious parr, which are fish that have not reached the smolting stage yet, may exist, but I haven't seen them, and I'm not aware of anybody else identifying them in the system. Precocious parr have been identified, though, in yearling spring Chinook stocks in other places. The emergence is timed on the ascending limb of the freshet. Emergence typically occurs in April and May, and again, that emergence timing is determined by the temperature in the red, and that red temperature is stabilized by groundwater. And then the newly emerged fry, that emergence, it occurs on the ascending limb, and as the water comes up, the fry move into these marginal areas, what really are ephemeral habitats, a newly flooded habitat around the edges and the margins of the stream. And then as the water recedes later on, as the freshet recedes, the fish move back on channel, and they've grown considerably by then and are able to maintain station and territory in cases where they're territorial. Within the juvenile life histories of these Chinook, there's really three variants, I guess might be the right term. One group would emerge and really drift passively and move actively downstream out of the natal stream into the lower Thompson and into the Fraser, largely overwintering and smolting from the lower Fraser. A second group will emerge in the Nicola and cold water Spies, remain in the natal stream really through the first summer, doing as if they were going to remain there, but then in the late fall, late summer, and really peaking in mid-fall to late fall, out-migrate into the lower Thompson and possibly further downstream where they overwinter and smolt from those locations again as 1+ juveniles. The third variation is sort of what we classically think of with Pacific salmon, where they emerge, remain in the natal stream all the way through there, to being 1+, and then smolting from the natal stream. What's important to know is that those may be sort of classifications, but there's a very large amount of overlap between those strategies. And in fact, back in the 1980s, Colin Levings and Ray Lazier ran an inclined plane trap at the mouth of the Nicola from March right through December, basically through the ice-free period, and there were Chinook juveniles leaving every day, although there were peaks definitely of those emigrations. The movement downstream may be passive, somewhat, may be more active downstream into the Thompson and Fraser. And those that remain in the natal stream, as they come back onto the stream out of the ephemeral habitats, they then are going to sort of take up station, feeding on drift and emerging insects. And the summer habitats typically in the runs. Now, we've come to understand more recently that there is use of refugia through the summertime, which may be thermal. They may also be directly linked to avoidance of predation. And so we start to see a nocturnal behavior of the fish through late July and into August, where fish come into these refugia during the daytime and then distribute themselves out on stream at night, at times when they feed. And during the nighttime, they're less vulnerable to visual predators such as birds. This diagram here really illustrates the complexity of the juvenile life history, starting up in the upper left corner, where we have fish emerging, and then we have really the three different strategies. The classic, what we consider with Pacific salmon is the green, the pale green boxes moving across the top and down, so fish emerging in the natal stream, remaining in the natal stream through the summer, then overwintering in the natal stream and moving down as smolts into the Thompson and Fraser and off into the ocean. You'll notice that also at the end of the summer, though, we have the second group noted there where fish move out of the natal stream down into the Thompson. That's the orange box group, where those fish smolt from the Thompson and possibly also the lower Fraser, again smolting as 1+. And then we've got the yellow group, which may move down out of the Nicola immediately and into the Thompson, or right down into the lower Fraser, and then again smolt as yearlings. So these are not hard and fast, as I said. Those are kind of the peaks, but there's clines in between them. Within the juvenile history, or life history within the Nicola River itself, we've got significant issues with loss of habitat stability, loss of riparian, loss of channel structure, increased temperatures, right? And these are likely impacting insect productivity and other things like that, which then impact the survival of the juveniles within the system. This particular picture here, was taken in 2017, I believe, after the large avulsion that happened out of Gishon Creek. And you can see the channel migration, channel instabilities that have occurred. So in later fall, as we've noted, some of the juveniles from the system may move down into the lower Thompson to overwinter, and we've had others that are already migrated down into the Thompson and then moving down into the Fraser. The overwintering that's occurring both in the Thompson and in the Fraser is typically in the interstices of large rock, in the Thompson and in the Nicola. Down in the Fraser, there's different habitats entirely involved with overwintering. The fish in the Nicola are particularly dependent on these interstices of large rock serviced by groundwater, as these are the areas that avoid freezing in anchor ice. So once the downstream migration happens, you can see on this particular map here, we've got the Nicola River highlighted and the Thompson, the Fraser, and you can see Gulf of Alaska, Bering Sea, and the whole North Pacific Ocean. We have juveniles entering the Gulf of Georgia, right, in April and May. Typically the migration into the ocean is in late April. And the fish, when they enter the ocean, migrate north, and they remain on the continental shelf. And as this diagram illustrates here, you've got fish leaving the Gulf of Georgia through the north, remaining on the continental shelf and moving right on the continental shelf round the Gulf of Alaska. And various tracking studies have followed juveniles out of the Fraser as far as Kodiak. Kodiak's important because at this stage we believe that a number of these fish are then moving in and out of the Bering Sea. We believe that they're spending summers in the Bering and then moving out of the Bering as it becomes relatively inhospitable over the winter and out into the North Pacific Ocean. We do have tag recoveries that have occurred in the Bering Sea. These are recoveries from the Bering Sea pollock fishery, and we have seen recoveries, the very occasional recovery from around Kodiak as well. The return migrations are believed to be from the Aleutians and directly across the North Pacific, and those migrations tend to be orientated such that they arrive at Juan de Fuca entrance. Now, they're not laser sharp, and that distribution may be a few hundred kilometers to the north and south, but with the bulk of the fish arriving around the Juan de Fuca entrance. Again, we get CWT recoveries, so Côte d'Ivoire tag recoveries, occurring off the west coast, right, and in the entrance fisheries and in fisheries into the Gulf of Georgia as these fish move through and into the Fraser. And the timing of those recoveries is typically in the early spring and early summer during the migration period. And our belief is that the fish are moving fairly quickly once they hit the continental shelf directly into the Fraser. So again, if you see here, you can see we believe the migration crosses directly across the open Pacific, not returning on the continental shelf in the direction of the juvenile migrations. And again, if the water is slightly warmer, we believe that the fish will maintain their orientation, but the entire distribution will shift to the north so that maybe the center of the distribution moves up to the northern end of Vancouver Island. And in years where the water is particularly cold, again, the fish will be in their sort of ideal temperature range, and the whole distribution may shift to the south a little bit. The in-river migration itself, depending on the stock group, as we've noted, the fish will enter the Fraser from relatively early in the spring right through to early and even the back end of the Nicola fish in midsummer. Spias and coldwater fish are the first entrants into the Fraser, and the first of those is going to be around the end of March, and the peak of the Spias and coldwater fish entering the Fraser will be around the back end of April and really into early May. The Nicola fish, the first of those that we're going to see entering the Fraser, and we know this using the Albion test fish genetic data. The Nicola migrants, we'll see the first of them in the back end of May, and they're really going to peak past Albion in late June or very early July. And the last of them we're going to see right the way through into early August. In terms of the entry into the terminal area, the Spias and coldwater fish are going to enter into the Nicola out of the Thompson in May and June, and they're going to migrate up into those middle and upper areas of the system using the descending limb of the freshet. Right? So that freshet gets them past those areas that they need to be past that are going to set up and become thermal refugia or thermal barriers to migration later on. Again, the Spias and coldwater fish are spawning in mid to late August and peaking in mid to late August. There is a little bit of spawning in early September, and they're up in the upper reaches of those systems. For the Nicola adults, they're entering the Nicola system again starting in June, but the entry really peaks in the last week of July and then tails off through August, given normal flow and temperature conditions in the Nicola. The Nicola Chinook themselves tend to stage in deeper pools throughout the Nicola system, and it's pretty typical that they stage in pools that are serviced by groundwater, giving them cooler holding habitats. And they'll distribute themselves out of those pools in early September through mid-September into the spawning habitats. So the spawning itself, the spawners select groundwater-influenced sort of areas of the appropriate gravel with moderate flows. We've seen red construction in tailouts and runs, but again, the consistent factor is the groundwater surface water mix. And it's that groundwater that's really critical because that's going to stop the anchor ice formation during the low flow period in the winter. The onset of spawning typically occurs with the onset of 12 degrees Celsius water. Now, the water fluctuates dramatically diurnally in temperature, but that first taste of 12-degree water typically happens in the Nicola around the 1st or 2nd of September. The daytime high might fluctuate up as high as 18 or 19 degrees, but that 12 degrees is the thing that typically seems to trigger the spawning. Where access is possible, where and when, Spias Creek fish will enter Maca Creek, which is one of the tributaries to Upper Spias. Maca is a really interesting system. It's relatively low gradient compared to Spias, and the flows really decrease through the summer in Maca, and the pools actually may become isolated by the time that spawning occurs in Maca. But the fish typically enter there in June or early July, before the flows become restrictive to entry. On the upper cold water, spawning may occur really even up above the last Coquihalla Highway crossing, way up above Mine Creek. But most of the spawning we seem to observe between Juliet and Mine. And a little bit of spawning downstream of Kingsvale, but not very much. Say the vast majority between Juliet and Mine Creek. So again, referring back to our chart, you can see Maca Creek on Upper Spias in the orange there, and then on the cold water, the early run stock being way upstream, and the principal spawning being between Juliet and Mine Creek and the upper freeway crossing. The main stem Nicola fish, the mauve colored there, those are later. So for enhancement within the system, enhancement has all been done through Spies Creek Hatchery. Spies Creek Hatchery was constructed in the early 1980s, and the first Chinook returns from Spies occurred in 1987. The Nicola fish returning to Spies have been coded wire tagged to provide a mark group for the survival and exploitation rate indicator under the Pacific Salmon Treaty. So Nicola was moved towards being a survival and exploitation rate indicator stock for the treaty in 1995. And current Nicola releases are around 180,000 ad-clipped, coded wire tagged yearling smolts a year. The early enhancement in Spies and Coldwater was also yearling smolts. However, as we ramped up the Nicola indicator and required a greater release of Nicola smolts to accommodate the requirements for the Salmon Treaty, there was a considerable conflict for availability of water in containers at Spies Creek Hatchery. And so we've cut back on the yearling smolt production at Spies and Coldwater and now are typically releasing around 50,000 fed fry on an annual basis as a conservation type release. The fed fry are otolith marked and they're also now marked so to speak, by parental-based tagging so that they can be identified in that manner as well. For the Nicola, the actual assessment activities prior to 1995, all the assessment activities were aerial overflights, typically 2 aerial overflight counts, timed right around the peak of spawning, so typically those flights were around the 12th and 15th of September. The attempt was to count the number of spawners, holders, and carcasses at that time, and then that was assumed or divided by the total count divided by 0.65, and that gave you an escapement estimate. Since 1995, we have established a stratified Peterson marker capture, and that work is done in complete partnership with Nicola Tribal Association, now STC, and that work has yielded a much more precise and accurate series of escapement estimates. There was an extended period there where we did the overflight estimates and the marker capture, and that allowed us to then go back and calibrate the previous overflight estimate series. Returns from the 180,000 yearling smolts are then used to provide mark groups for Chinook survival and exploitation for the indicator stock. So those fish, we get both fishery recoveries from the AD-CWT fish and recoveries in the escapement, and the marker capture allows us to determine the proportion of the marked fish in the escapement and get an estimate of escapement by tag group by year. So it's one of the DFO assessment staff, Tony Rathbone, with a hatchery male Chinook, which has been tagged, and Tony's about to release it back into the river. So in Spies and Coldwater, the assessment activities have revolved around aerial overflights. There was a period of time when the NTA crew also did some walks on areas of the stream that were difficult to see from the air. But the vast majority of the work in Spies and Coldwater has been done based on 2 aerial overflights a year. And then the upper Nicola and Spawning has been just surveyed on a sort of opportunistic manner. There's a number of times that we would have flown the Nicola, and then if we had time and fuel and otherwise would fly Spawning and upper Nicola on the way back to Kamloops to get counts of those systems. This chart here is taken from the Chinook Technical Committee Catch and Escapement Report. It's showing the escapements to the Nicola. The gray bars to the left, 1994, and to the left are the calibrated visual series. To the 1995 to the right are the mark recapture estimates, and the black line at a little over 6,000 is the estimated number of spawners that it requires to produce maximum sustained yield from the system. In this chart here, you can see the estimated hatchery contribution to the total escapement. The wild spawners are designated in green, and the enhanced escapement or enhanced contribution to the escapement are in red. So again, you can see the very large contribution in 1991 and the particularly small contribution in 1996, and you can see that that's varied quite considerably through time. Marine survivals, which we have estimated using the hatchery stock, so using those hatchery fish, you can see marine survival has fluctuated quite considerably, and that exceptionally low marine survival period that you see in brood year 92, 93, 94 are associated with those myxobacterial problems that were being experienced at Spies Creek Hatchery. It's likely that the marine survival was higher during that period of time, but we can't say for sure. Since 2000, we've had brood year 2000, we've had some pretty poor marine survivals, and the stock's been fluctuating, this relatively low marine survival level, with the exception of 1 year, brood 2006, where kind of came back to a moderate level. But you can see we've been a relatively poor marine survival period. The escapements to Coldwater and Spies, as we've noted earlier, have been determined by aerial overflight. Those estimates have been or have ranged from a low of 15 in both systems. In Coldwater, the low of 15 was observed in 2009, and the high of almost 2,100 was observed in 1985. The average escapement through that period's been around 650. In Spies, again, that low of 15 in this case was in 2007, and the highest that we've ever observed is just over 1,850, with an average of around 380 fish. Hatchery returns to both of those systems also started in 1987. Again, very few or no external marks in most years, especially as there's been very little coated wire tagging in those systems. And a lot of the attempts to actually determine the hatchery contributions have been limited to dead pitch activities, or at least the ability to examine the brood stock that was taken in subsequent years. So using otolith thermal marks and looking at brood stock, we've been able to see what an estimate, a very imprecise estimate likely, of what the contribution to the escapement might have been. It's unlikely that those contributions of the hatchery fish have exceeded 20%. So escapement to both of those systems through time is presented on this slide, and you can see that the escapements have fluctuated, but they've fluctuated largely in sync with each other. In terms of the fishery exploitation data, we've used the Nicola coated wire tags to provide us an index of that exploitation. The exploitation rates that we've observed through time have fluctuated from a low of below 10% all the way up to a high of greater than 60%. But typically, around 70% of the total mortality for the tag group is occurring in the escapement. So in other words, that would be an exploitation rate of around 30%. The greatest impacts that we're seeing are typically in freshwater fisheries, so that's once the fish have re-entered the Fraser. And we're also seeing some modest exploitation in the approach fisheries, and typically those approach fisheries, what I'm referring to is the Juan de Fuca and Southern Strait of Georgia sport fisheries. The impacts in freshwater have been in previous days significantly in freshwater sport, but largely in First Nations fisheries targeting spring Chinook in the Fraser and in the Thompson. So on this slide we provide information about the total exploitation rates for the Nicola and the mortality distribution. Both of these charts came from the calibration and exploitation report of the Chinook Technical Committee. On the left, we have the total exploitation rate estimates by year since the first brood year of returns to the Nicola. The landed catch mortality is illustrated in blue, and the estimates for the incidental mortality in red. On the right side of the slide, you can see the mortality distributions. We've provided two mortality distributions for the two most recent salmon treaty periods, 1999 to 2008, and then from 2009 through current. And you can see that the percent of the total mortality in the escapement has gone up very slightly in the most recent period. And this is sort of the end of the road of my talk. Just it's where to from here. When you look at the devastation that has occurred in the Nicola River and the braided gravel channel in this picture downstream of Niuwayich, one has to ask what's going to happen to the Nicola Chinook.